Today we will have a very outstanding lecture from Dr. Tandy on this reformulation of Rawls' original position. Let us welcome Tandy.
Thank you. Yes, the title of the presentation is Revising Rawls, a Force of Nature Original Position. The revising Rawls part is really for two reasons. Revising Rawls, I'm going to talk about how John Rawls revises what he himself said earlier in his subsequent publications, but also I'm going to try to revise Rawls myself as well to give an alternative position. So there's really two parts to the revising. Rawls himself tries to modify or revise what he said previously, and then I, in turn, I'm also going to try to revise and modify what Rawls says. And when I get to my part, I'm calling that a force of nature original position. Maybe I should say a force of nature political conception, but anyway, I think that my point of view has some semblance to the approach that John Rawls takes, or at least you can use his approach, but what I say I think will be significantly different at the same time. If you want to go to one of my websites, you can go to www.drtandy.com, and then that will refer you to some other of my websites as well. On my website, this website, it will have other websites where you can click on my various publications. So some of my publications are available on the internet by going directly or indirectly through this website to my publications. Also, I want to emphasize that this is a rough draft. I'm just trying to write my ideas down initially, and it could be that many changes should be made. So I'm wanting you to give me your comments and your criticisms. I give you my email address up there. The idea is that at this stage I need many criticisms and comments to more fully develop the paper. Now, just briefly, you will notice here I've divided into two parts, part one and part two. And the part one section, I'm mostly talking about John Rawls. And I'm also talking about the revisions that John Rawls makes to his own work. But then in part two, I'm presenting my own alternative, which is action-oriented. So it's less conceptual in certain respects, but it's very much oriented towards action. Okay. So we will just give you an abstract. Of course, as you already know, John Rawls is one of the most prominent political philosophers of the 20th century. And as I say in part one, I'm going to tell you something about John Rawls and his positions, and also I'm going to try to come up with a revision based on what himself said. He died in the year 2002. I feel maybe if he had lived longer, he would have tried to put together all of his revisions into maybe a new book. But what we have is just, I think, a number of works after his original work back in 1971 that we call Theory of Justice, that he called the Theory of Justice. And I think it would have been great if before he died he could have issued some grand masterpiece where he tried to incorporate all of the many revisions that he had made since 1971. But so we can take what he said after 1971 and try to revise what he said in his famous book, A Theory of Justice, in 1971. And then I say in part two, I'm going to present my own point of view, which I think does have some relationship to some of the points that Rawls makes. And in part two, I'm going to argue that in one manner of speaking, we can achieve almost universal peace and do it very quickly. I will explain how, because of our physical technology and our social technology, we can put these together to produce a force of nature, a new force of nature, so that we will have almost universal peace and have it very quickly. But I'll get that to at the end. But I think it does have a relationship to some of the basic ideas that Rawls tries to present. So, to introduce, I do want to give you a quote from John Rawls where he says that change is possible. We can change our political institutions. But also he says we can change other things as well. And then I give a quote from Al Gore where he says, now Al Gore is thinking about climate change when he says that we have become more powerful than any force of nature. But the point I'm going to make is that we can not only make changes in our political and social institutions, we can also make changes with respect to physical technology. So I'm going to try to put together certain social technologies and certain physical technologies which I believe we could implement immediately together to produce a force of nature that would, I would like to think, do much good to change our world very quickly. So I start out, I'm just trying to introduce you to some of the basic ideas of Rawls. Here you have the famous philosopher Martha Nussbaum telling us that John Rawls, she thinks, is the most distinguished moral and political philosopher of our age. And I just mentioned here a few phrases like justice as fairness, or the original position, are phrases that we identify very strongly with the philosopher John Rawls. Now, the idea of justice as fairness is centered on the idea of free and equal citizens. In other words, the idea of a justice as fairness is a society that is fair or just in the sense that a society is a system of cooperation that is publicly transparent. And it's fair based on the idea that we are free and equal citizens. So if you start from a different position, if you do not feel that you want a society that based on the premise of free and equal citizens, then you will get a different type of philosophy. But he's taking the approach of justice as fairness. To be fair to everyone, you have to approach it that your society is made up of citizens who are free and equal. That's his approach. Another phrase that he's famous for is the phrase original position. And here, as we will discuss later, he's talking about a kind of first step that you can take as a thought experiment to try to come up with a proper idea of the just or fair principles of a just society. And then he also will talk about what he calls reflective equilibrium. And there are different types of reflective equilibrium. But here, one way to think about it is that he wants to think about the conditions of the original position, the first step, the conditions of the subsequent steps, the actual empirical conditions of the real world, to get feedback so that ultimately you produce a political conception that all works together in a cooperative way. Now, later on, after he published his classic book, A Theory of Justice, back in 1971, John Rawls said that his theory or his book was flawed, that his theory, his book was confused, and that one of the main problems with that book, in his opinion, is that he did not fully understand the proper role of a political conception in his theorizing. Now, in other words, now John Rawls wants to make the distinction that he considers extremely important to political theory, that you want to make the distinction on the one hand between a political conception and on the other hand a comprehensive doctrine. That is to say, a political conception is where you're trying to think about the level of what it is to be a citizen of a society. But when you think about comprehensive doctrines, you're thinking about what I believe about everything. what I believe about religion, what I believe about my personal relationships. In other words, he says that really he should have developed it along the lines that you can have a political conception that many people who are very different from each other can agree on. You may have one religion, you may have another religion. You may have one metaphysics or philosophy, you may have another metaphysics or philosophy. But yet we may be able to all agree together that we should live together in one society under a particular political conception, what it means to be a good citizen or live in a fair or just society. So he says that the way he did it originally back in '71, he didn't make that distinction, and therefore at times he's trying to justify and espouse a comprehensive doctrine, but in fact he wants to devise a society where people of many different views can live together. You don't have to have one narrow view in terms of metaphysics or philosophy or religion, but instead people of many views can live together in one society. So he says that's what he did not realize, that he should have been orienting his theory towards a political conception, developing a society that everyone, or most everyone, can live in, regardless of their religion or their philosophy. So one of the things that he's famous for is he believes that you can formulate a political philosophy or a political conception without first formulating a metaphysics or a philosophy in general. In other words, some philosophers take the approach, I'm going to develop a metaphysics or a philosophy, a comprehensive viewpoint, and then I'm going to justify the way philosophers do, justify what I believe. And then I'm going to develop maybe an ethics or a political conception for society from there. But he says no. What he's going to do is go right to the heart of the problem. He's going to pay as little attention as possible to metaphysics. He's going to pay as little attention as possible to various religions and philosophical views. He wants to go directly to a political conception that he hopes that if he does it right, many people of many philosophies and many metaphysics can all agree to. Now, we can also mention that he believed that you could, depending on your project at hand, you could come up with many different approaches. He's not saying that his approach that he used back in 1971, or some revision of that approach, is the only approach to developing a just society or a good political conception. So he also believes that you can develop alternative original positions or first steps. You can develop alternative approaches to the construction of political theory. He doesn't want to say that you must do it only one way, only the way I do it, approximately the way I did it back in 1971. So actually he himself develops at least two different approaches, two different original positions, two different theories that are different because he's doing different things. And the first one, he's trying to talk about what it is to have a just society. Now that would be a theory of justice, his 1971 book and later revisions, or Justice as Fairness, the conditions of a just society. But later on, in 1999, he will produce the law of peoples. And there he's talking about a different topic. The different topic is how can different peoples, different societies, different states live together in a decent way in the world. So he's going to approach the two projects in different ways. Now another phrase that he has made very famous is the veil of ignorance. And here again, he will use the veil of ignorance approach in different ways depending on what he's trying to do. But for example, well, first of all, let's say, what is it that he's trying to accomplish by having a veil of ignorance in the original position, or in the first step? And basically, much of what John Rawls does, as we know, is strongly influenced or strongly inspired by Immanuel Kant. And so Immanuel Kant, among many other things, pointed out that there's a very close relationship between authentic autonomy on the one hand and making good moral decisions on the other hand. And yet, Kant also pointed out that it's very difficult for us to make good, reasonable moral decisions and have authentic autonomy. That often, due to our desires, our passions, our perspectives, sometimes we're not conscious of them. We may not make the correct moral decision. We may think that we are autonomous and making genuine autonomous decisions when we are not. We are following passions or desires or perspectives that are not, do not promote morality, do not promote autonomy in the genuine, authentic sense. So John Rawls is trying to come up with a methodology so that he will, he thinks, partially be able to overcome the mistakes that we make about centering things on ourselves, our own desires and passions and perspectives. If you're making a moral decision according to Kant, then you have to think about what is right as a universal law. So when John Rawls develops the original position or first step, and he comes up with the idea of a veil of ignorance, in the theory of justice, here's the way he uses the idea of a veil of ignorance in a theory of justice. He says, let us imagine that we are representing the citizens of a society, and we're going to get together and decide on the just, fair principles for the structure of a just, good society. And so to do that, the best way to do that, to overcome the problem of passions and desires and perspectives that may not promote justice or fairness, we have to pretend that we are representing citizens that exist in this imaginary society. And we do not know which citizen we are representing as we try to decide on the principles of justice. As we try to agree with each other on the principles of justice, I do not know which citizen I am representing. I could represent a citizen with one religious view or another. It could be someone with one type of passions and desires or a different type of passions and desires. One perspective, and I could be a very lucky person or a very unlucky person. I could have one religious view or another religious view. I could be at the top economically, or I could be very poor, living in poverty. I don't know who I'm representing when I'm deliberating in the original position in a veil of ignorance. And therefore, the idea is that we would want to be fair. We would want to be fair to the equal citizens that should be equal in our society as we decide on the principles of justice. So this is a kind of state of nature. We're trying to produce, so to speak, a state of nature that is fair and just, because we do not know the citizen that we represent. Therefore, we have to represent whoever that person is. We don't know their religion. We don't know if they're powerful or weak, or rich or poor, or lucky or unlucky in life. Therefore, you see here that Rawls says, even in the original 1971, he says, we can view the choice of the original position from the standpoint of one person selected at random. So although in one sense we're thinking about just a huge number of people representing all the citizens, but we don't know which citizens we're representing as we deliberate, we're supposed to agree unanimously on what the principles of justice are. And therefore, it's equivalent ultimately to one person selected at random would choose these principles of justice. And so I want to also emphasize that not only does he have alternative original positions, depending on whether you take the theory of justice or the law of peoples, but we can see that he's open also to alternative approaches to theory construction, as we will talk about more in a moment. So, let's talk about the theory construction used in a theory of justice back in 1971. In 2001, he summarizes very quickly the sequences that he discusses in more detail back in 1971. The four-stage sequence for his theory construction in a theory of justice. Now, the first stage we have already mentioned. That is the original position in a veil of ignorance. In the original position, the first stage, the veil of ignorance, then you have a thick veil of ignorance. You don't know who you're representing. It could be anyone whatsoever, so you want to be very just and fair to everyone. But gradually, as you go to the other stages, the limits on your knowledge are relaxed. So when you get to the final stage, there is no veil of ignorance. So we start out with the first stage with a very strong veil of ignorance, the original position. From there, you develop the principles of justice. And then you go to the next stage. Based on principles of justice, you write a constitution. You have a constitutional convention, and you write a constitution for your society based on the principles of justice. And then at the legislative stage, you can enact the laws that are in agreement with the Constitution and in agreement with the principles of the original position. Of course, in the final stage, you're talking about the real world. In the final stage, you're at the real world where you actually have to apply the rules, and there is no veil of ignorance, I believe, at that stage. So let's mention the two major principles that he articulates back in 1971, but we're going to state these two major principles the way he revised them in 2001. So these are the two major principles that he's famous for in his 1971 book, but we're going to state these two principles as he revised them in the year 2001. The first principle, the basic idea is we have basic liberties. Each citizen is equal, and we have equal basic liberties that we want to maximize as long as they're congruent with every person having equal basic liberties. And then you have a second principle, which is really two principles in one. And this is not basic liberties, but now we're talking about inequalities, social and economic inequalities, rather than basic liberties. First, he believes in fair equality of opportunity, that there should be fair equality for everyone for the positions open in society. And secondly, he thinks that the positions should be structured in such a way that they will benefit the least advantaged members of society. So on the one hand, when the positions open up, they should be open on an equal basis to everyone. And no one should get privileged treatment just because they know someone, for example, or because they have a lot of money or prestige. But also, the basic offices and inequality should be structured so that it's going to work to the advantage of the least advantaged sector of society. This is very famous. He calls this the difference principle. So Rawls will try to defend the difference principle, although he realizes that before he dies that he wasn't quite as successful in defending it as he hoped he would be. And these two principles are in lexical priority. In other words, the first principle has priority over the second principle. And when you look at the second principle, you find that the principle of fair equality of opportunity has priority over the difference principle. So in many of the textbooks and encyclopedias and so forth, you will hear this phrase about the Rawls' two principles and two priorities. And when you see this is what they're referring to. The two principles would be the first principle of basic liberties and the second principle that involves fair equality of opportunity, but also the difference principle. The two priorities is that principle 1 has priority over principle 2, and within principle 2, the fair equality of opportunity has priority over the difference principle. So you get the so-called two principles and two priorities. However, as we will see, with his revisions, you're going to have more than two principles and more than two priorities as he revises his own points of view after 1971. And even in 1971 in the book itself, if you look closely. So to simplify the theory of justice, or the justice as fairness four-stage sequence of theory construction, he starts out by constructing the first stage, the original position, under a veil of ignorance. And as it's in the established textbooks, they will say that he establishes the two principles of justice that we just mentioned in the original position. And then after that, hypothetically, you have a constitutional convention, and you're supposed to incorporate the first principle, the basic liberties, at the stage of the Constitution. When you get to the legislative stage, you have to think about social and political inequalities. And there you should incorporate the two principles contained in the second principle at the legislative stage. And then, of course, the final stage, you have to apply the rules in the real world. It's not just hypothetical at that stage anymore. So we've said that he has two broad theories. One would be justice as fairness, or theory of justice, but also we have said that he has the law of peoples. So on the one hand, the justice as fairness, he is trying to construct a domestic just society, and in the law of peoples, he's trying to construct a law that would provide decent relationships between decent societies. And so, as he approaches the law of peoples, decent relationships between decent societies, he thinks about the different types of societies that might exist. And as he imagines the different types of societies, he decides that you can think about those societies that might be very similar to what you would get if you took the justice as fairness approach. And he refers to those as constitutional democracies. So he believes that although there are many types of constitutional democracies, that probably you're going to get some form of many possible forms of a constitutional democracy if you follow his basic principles of justice. But on the other hand, he realizes that what he's trying to do here is to have decent relations between societies. So he realizes that there may be societies that are not democracies. So he tries to imagine that there might possibly be a society that you would say it's not entirely just according to justice as fairness, but it is a pretty decent society. They don't have any great injustices or evils, even though we would not want to call it a just society in the strict sense of the word. So he refers to these together as well-ordered. In other words, if you think about the constitutional democracies that at least are supposed to be following his theory of justice, and you think about societies that are not, but still they might be somewhat decent, he calls them well-ordered, the well-ordered societies, or decent societies. And so now, based here on what Rawls himself says, let's compare the original positions in theory of justice and in the law of peoples, and see how they are different from each other. So one of the differences of three respects that he mentions, we will mention four, but he talks about three. The first one that he mentions is that in the theory of justice, we are representing individual citizens in the under the veil of ignorance. But under the law of peoples, we're not representing individual citizens, we're representing societies or governments or peoples. So that would be one difference. Relating to that, if you're talking about individual citizens, typically they would each one have their own comprehensive doctrine. Each individual citizen would have their own religion or their own philosophy that is comprehensive. But on the other hand, if you look at entire societies, entire peoples, entire states, there typically they would have a political conception because they are one political unit. But they would not have one religion or one comprehensive doctrine. although it's possible. But typically in a constitutional democracy, at least as envisioned by John Rawls, each individual citizen would have their own comprehensive doctrines, but they would all live together in one society, one political conception. Now, a second difference between the original position in the law of justice, the theory of justice and the law of peoples, is we think about when we are in the original position, we are representing, who are we representing and what interests do we represent? Well, in the theory of justice, we are representing the interest of individual citizens. But in the law of peoples, we're representing the fundamental interest of societies or peoples. So when you think about the interest of individuals, they would be interested in what is good for them. They would be interested in pursuing their individual happiness. But when you think about the law of peoples, they would have a conception of justice in terms of they want to be respected by other states. They want to be respected by other peoples. So the two original positions would have to be different. When you're representing an individual and their fundamental interest, that is a different original position when you're trying to represent a society and the fundamental interest of a particular people or society. And then a third difference that John Rawls mentions between a theory of justice and the law of peoples is that the principles that you're trying to come up with in a theory of justice are the principles of a just domestic society, a domestic society that is just or fair. But when you're trying to come up with the original position of the law of peoples, you're trying to establish the principles or the rules that he calls the law of peoples. That is how all decent societies or peoples would relate to each other. And then we can also come up with an additional one, that a fourth one as well. Oops, I went too far now. Here we are. Another difference between the theory of justice and the law of peoples would be obviously that with the original positions being different, the veils of ignorance are going to be different also. It does appear, you can interpret it that although the original positions and the veil of ignorance would be different in each case, that in the law of peoples, the original position, veil of ignorance, would be lighter. Now, the reason you can argue that it would be lighter is because when you are a representative in the original position in the law of peoples, you know that you are representing a decent or a well-ordered society. In other words, you have some idea of the society or the people that you represent. They might be, on the one hand, constitutional democracies, or they may not be democracies, but you know they are decent people, even if they're not democracies. But that would be different, of course, from the theory of justice, where you could be representing any citizen whatsoever. You don't know what citizen you're representing, but here, in the law of peoples, you do have some idea of who you're representing. Now, if you have recently read the Law of Peoples, published in 1999, you may think that you can go further. You may think that you can go further than saying that I know that I'm representing a well-ordered people. You may say, actually, as I read the Law of Peoples, he presents two different original positions in the Law of Peoples. One original position would be for constitutional democracies. The other original position would be those people who are not in democracies, but they live in societies that are decent. And therefore, the way he does it, he has one original position and they develop a law of peoples. He has the other original position and they develop a law of peoples. So you might say, not only do you know that you're representing a decent, or that is a well-ordered people, but you also know either that you're representing, in this original position, a constitutional democracy, or if you're in the other position, you know you're representing a decent non-democracy. That would be your first reaction, I think. However, I think that the argument, what you find when he does this, the way he does it, he says that the law of peoples will be identical in each case. In other words, if you have an original position of original democracies, and they come up with a law of peoples, and you have another original position, they are non-democracies, but they are decent societies, and they come up with the law of peoples, he says they come up with the same law of peoples. So the law of peoples for constitutional democracies and the law of peoples for decent non-democracies, he says they would be identical in terms of the basic principles that they establish. But you see, if that is true, if you assume that is true, what this means is that really you could just have one big original position, and you don't know whether you're representing the constitutional democracies or you don't know whether you're representing the decent non-democracies, because you're going to come up with the same results. And therefore, you could argue that really you do not know whether you are in a constitution, whether you're representing in the original position a constitutional democracy or whether you're representing a decent non-democracy. All you know is that you're representing a well-ordered society, but you don't know what type of well-ordered society it is. But still, that would be a lighter veil of ignorance, I think, than what you get in a theory of justice. And so you can see that if you were constructing a theory in the law of peoples, that the sequence would be very different. The law of peoples is very simple and direct by comparison. In other words, under the law of peoples in the original position, you come directly to the rules that you would use as the law of peoples. And then you say, aha, we have the principles, the rules that they should use. Then it's just a matter of the well-ordered peoples getting together and say, okay, we're going to follow the law of peoples. It's very straightforward and simple in that case. So by comparison, this is a much simpler theory in that respect than a theory of justice would be. Now we're going to try to look at what Rawls has said over the years to revise his own thinking. In other words, Rawls has written much after 1971 saying that he was wrong here, or he was maybe right here, or if he had it to do again, here's the way he would do it. He has been revising himself. So now let's take a look. This is just my personal reading. I have not been able to read everything written by Rawls, and certainly I think very few or no one has written everything that has been written by about John Rawls. There's just too much. So many philosophers have written so much about John Rawls, I don't think one person would have time to read everything. So not only, of course, as you would expect, have I not read most of the literature that exists on John Rawls, but I have not read most of the things, or at least all of the things that John Rawls wrote. This would be true of many philosophers, of course. But anyway, based on my readings of John Rawls, and based on my readings about John Rawls, here's what I would conclude that he might have said if he had lived a bit longer and tried to write a revised edition of John Rawls, his theories. I believe that a good case can be made that this is what he would say, because I think it's very clear this is what he did say. If you read what he wrote after 1971, to me it's very clear that this is what he did. But it is my opinion, of course, my construction. I did, in an earlier draft of this, I did decide to check with Samuel Freeman to see what he might say. I did email Samuel Freeman, and he was kind enough to email me back saying that I might be onto something. He didn't have anything negative to say about my point, the points that I'm going to be making. So that made me feel rather good that perhaps I might be onto something. It is, to me, it's a little bit surprising that no one has done this before. You would think that such a famous philosopher, and there's been so many books and articles about John Rawls, that someone would have already done this. But as far as I'm aware, no one has done this before, trying to decide what Rawls would say based on what he did say in revising his previous works. So it appears to me that this is what his revised position would be. First of all, I think he would not have two principles, but he would have 5 principles and not 2. And I think you would have these in lexical priority. So you wouldn't have the so-called classic 2 principles and 2 priorities. I think you would have these 5 principles, and each would have their own priority. So I will discuss these, of course, as we go on. But here, I start out with something that we have not mentioned previously, because Rawls did not mention it until perhaps, I'm not sure exactly when he mentioned it, but it was certainly far beyond, I think, 1971. And that is, he apparently read the book in 1990, published by Pfeiffer, if that's how it is, the political philosopher Pfeiffer, published his work in 1990, and on John Rawls. And he was saying that actually, before the principle number 1, there's one that should have greater priority, that we call here metabasic rights. And we will talk about this in just a moment. And John Rawls agrees very clearly. John Rawls agrees that these rights from Pfeiffer 1990 are prior to all the others that we're talking about here. And then he goes to we would go to his principle number 1, basic liberties. And then, as we go to the classic Rawls principle number 2, we're going to divide that up into 2 principles. We have the equal opportunity part of his classic principle number 2, and we have the difference principle part of his principle number 2, which we're going to make principle number 4. Because in the middle, number 3 here, we have this new principle that we have made up, that we're calling just assistance. And we're making up this 3rd one based on the writings that John Rawls has said with respect to what he calls the just savings principle and what he calls the duty of assistance principle. So we're going to talk about this in more detail, of course. Okay, so now we will talk about the metabasic rights. And so here we're calling this principle 0. And this is lexically prior to all the others. And so Rawls paraphrases, it's from 2001. Just before he died, in 2001, he published Justice as Fairness, a Restatement. And so on page 44, note number 7, he makes it very clear that this principle that we're calling principle 0 is lexically prior to all the other principles. And so he paraphrases the other philosopher Pfeiffer. And he paraphrases this principle 0 as that basic needs be met, at least insofar as they're being met, is a necessary condition for citizens to understand and to be able to fruitfully exercise their basic rights and liberties. In other words, he's saying that if you're talking about principle 1 as your basic liberties, you have to think about people being in a condition to appreciate and to act on their basic liberties. It doesn't make any sense to talk about basic liberties if people are not in a physical and mental state to be able to genuinely use those basic liberties or rights. And then we're going to mention here this principle number 3. We said that we decided to add this principle number 3 that we're calling just assistance. But we're basing this on 2 parts of his writings. We have, actually, if you go back to 1971 in A Theory of Justice, he talks about the just savings principle. And so actually, I would think that back in 1971, we should have been talking about the just savings principle, even with the publication of his 1971 book. And he's talking about how we also should think about our duty towards future generations and not just think about our present generation. And then in 1991, in the Law of Peoples, he talks about the duty of assistance to assist those societies who are burdened. Now, in each case, if you look at the just savings principle back in 1971, where you're supposed to have a duty towards future generations, or at least the next generation, he's not always clear there, you find that it's only under certain conditions that you have duty towards future generations or to the next generation. If it's clear, for example, that the next generation or future generations are going to be well taken care of, then you don't have to worry about it. It's only when you look at it in a just or a fair way and you say, it looks like the next generation or maybe future generations are not going to be treated fairly because we did not do things properly in our present generations. In that case, then you have a duty to think about the next generation or possibly later generations. So that doesn't always apply. Likewise, the duty of assistance. When you talk about the law of peoples, assisting those peoples, those societies that are in greatly burdened. They're so burdened that there's no way that they could possibly have a good society. Even if they had a great constitution, they're so burdened, it is not possible that they could have a good society. So we would have a duty in that case to help them out so that they could reach a certain level so that at least they would have the possibility of having a decent society. So both of these, the just savings principle that he mentions even back in his book in 1971, actually, and the duty of assistance to other societies who are greatly burdened in 1999, in each case, they are conditional. It is possible that the next generation is already taken care of and we don't have to worry about them. Or we could live in a world where every society, no society is greatly burdened, and therefore we do not have to assist any other society. But if we do have to be concerned with the next generation, then it is a duty. If we do find there are other societies that are greatly burdened, it is a duty. So it's not charity, but it's a moral duty that we're talking about. So what I have done here is I have incorporated these two principles together into principle number 3 that I call just assistance. And it seems clear to me from what Rawls says that it is principle number 3, that it comes after the equal opportunity principle in lexical priority, but it is in lexical priority ahead of the difference principle. I think he makes that very clear. But what I do here is I combine these two principles together into one principle. Also, as I read Rawls, I do not see any lexical priority between these two. So my belief is that he did not say that that principle A or principle B has lexical priority over the other. And then we could briefly mention that, of course, Immanuel Kant, his great inspiration, sometimes Immanuel Kant will talk about a cosmopolitan approach to viewing the world. And apparently Rawls thinks that should be translated Commonwealth of Ends. Now, I think most of the traditional books, they translate it as Kingdom of Ends, but Rawls says that it's very clear that the proper translation from German to English should say Commonwealth of Ends rather than a traditional translation of Kingdom of Ends. So anyway, as we all know, Immanuel Kant sometimes speaks in a very expensive way about the importance of all persons and having a cosmopolitan conception that we care about all persons and not some persons. But also Kant is very famous, of course, for his piece called Perpetual Peace that he wrote near the end of his life. And there, of course, John Rawls uses Kant's Perpetual Peace to develop the law of peoples. And so it's very clear to me, and most others I think, that in John Rawls there is this conflict or tension. On the one hand, if you recognize John Rawls as being interested in a cosmopolitan conception, which many but not everyone would, I would, and if you recognize Rawls as also being interested in the law of peoples at the same time, which certainly he is, then you would say there seems to be a conflict or a tension in John Rawls between these two. If we look at Immanuel Kant, that might be more complicated. I don't know if it's obvious to those who would be expert in Immanuel Kant if there really is a tension or a conflict in Immanuel Kant between his cosmopolitan conception and his non-cosmopolitan conception in Immanuel Kant. But certainly, if you read John Rawls, it's easy to conclude that there might be some conflict or tension in the thought of John Rawls between, if you accept that he does have a cosmopolitan view and his law of peoples view. For example, of course, there are several famous philosophers that have written about how the theory of justice really should be not just about justice in a domestic society, but it should be about a cosmopolitan justice. And so, of course, Poe is one of the more famous ones, but several famous philosophers have developed the theory of justice not as a domestic society, but as a cosmopolitan society. But my contention is that Rawls himself also is very interested in a cosmopolitan perspective. Now, you may not think so. If you read the Law of Peoples, you may say, he's certainly not a cosmopolitan. But I think there is that conflict or tension in John Rawls. And so, it seems to me, as I will briefly explain, as I will briefly explain, at times John Rawls does clearly seem to talk about a cosmopolitan or omnitemporal or eternal political conception. In other words, the political conceptions that he develops in the theory of justice and the political conception in the law of peoples, those are not they are not meant to be by him cosmopolitan. And they are not meant by John Rawls to be omnitemporal or eternal positions. They are meant to be focused on particular situations. You clearly define the conditions of the original position in each case. They're not meant to be all-encompassing for all times and all places. However, it seems clear to me that John Rawls is very interested in this. It seems, as I hope briefly show, he is very interested in the idea that we might someday be able to create an original position or a political conception that would be omnitemporal or eternal. That is, if you could develop this omnitemporal or eternal political conception, then the idea is that you could just apply it to every society and every stage of history, and it would all fit nicely together. You would know what the proper and just society should be like given certain conditions, certain temporal constraints that we all, in any stage of history, have to live in. But our constraints are different at different times. So, if you look back not only to his 1971 A Theory of Justice, but his revised version of A Theory of Justice in 1999, he continues to keep this in. I think he thinks this is important because the last page of the last section, 1971 edition, the last page of the last section, 1999 edition, Theory of Justice. He keeps this in. So he says, without conflating all persons into one, but recognize them as distinct and separate, the eternal original position enables us to be impartial, even between persons who are not contemporaries, but who belong to many generations. So to see our place in society from this eternal perspective is to regard the human situation not only from all social, but also from all temporal points of view. This eternal position is a certain form of thought and feeling thought, and feeling that we can adopt as rational persons within the world. Now, the famous Nobel laureate and economist, Amartya Sen, was a student and a great admirer of John Rawls. But Professor Sen, the Nobel laureate and economist, and a student of and a great admirer of John Rawls, he does criticize his teacher, John Rawls, by saying that the approach that John Rawls uses, you tend to get something like static objects. In other words, he doesn't seem to capture history as changing and dynamic. So Professor Sen points out that you really, to get a proper position, if you really want to think about a cosmopolitan or you want to think about an eternal position, you really have to think about the dynamics of history, the dynamics of freedom and development. And he thinks it's hard to do that by taking the approach that John Rawls takes. Now, actually, Sen has written a more recent book devoted to John Rawls and to his criticism of John Rawls, but I have not read that book. I've read his 1999 book, and he says the same thing on these pages in his 1999 book, which I have read. So one of the things that strikes me, sometimes one way to say it might be that Rawls is on a high philosophical mountain and the air is very thin, and it prevents a historical dynamic view of things. But the way I approach it, I don't know how to defend that exactly. I assume that Sen is able to defend himself very well. He's a very bright person. But I haven't read all of Sen's stuff. But the way I approach it, the way I see it, is that one of the problems, if you wanted to develop Rawls toward a omnitemporal or a cosmopolitan or an eternal original position, is that when you look at a theory of justice or when you look at the law of peoples, John Rawls is very much interested in the concept that we live in a world of moderate scarcity. He speaks with great admiration of Hume and Hume's point of view that we live in a world of moderate scarcity. In fact, at times when I read John Rawls, it seems to me that he's almost a Puritan at heart at times. To me, at times, it seems obvious to me that he is afraid of great wealth, whether within a world of moderate scarcity or if we had all great wealth beyond scarcity. I really feel that Rawls has a Puritan streak in him, where he's generally fearful of wealth, whether within moderate scarcity or beyond moderate scarcity. My feeling is that maybe he's afraid of wealth because he thinks that it makes people produce societies that are not just, or perhaps it means you have people who are not virtuous people. Now, my approach is going to disagree with this, what I would call a puritanical strain in John Rawls. And I'm going to approach this from the point of view that we should widen the idea of what we mean by fairness or justice. In other words, the John Rawls concept of justice as fairness, in my opinion, does not altogether understand and take into consideration the way it should the injustices from nature. Nature also produces great injustices. Persons are unjust to each other. Peoples or societies are unjust to each other. But I contend that nature also is unjust to us. In my opinion, Rawls does not fully appreciate the injustices of nature. And relating to that, I don't think Rawls has a proper conception of just what is possible given our technology that we have today. When we think about our great creativity and our ability to engage in social inventions and reorganizations, social inventions and political reorganization. And when you think about our physical technologies and how powerful they are, and how we might be able to reorient our creativity with recreating our social technologies and recreating our physical technologies, I think he doesn't fully realize how those could be used as a force of nature to create an entirely new set of environments that we've never experienced before. So I'm going to talk about new social structures that I believe can be done fairly easily if we decide to do it. And I'm going to talk about new physical structures that I believe can be done fairly easily, although it may take many decades to do. Still, I say it can be done fairly easily if we want to do it. So, one of the points I'm making is that we have advanced technologies available in terms of social technologies to change the political structure of society. We have technologies of physical technologies that are a force of nature. Now, I quoted Al Gore earlier, and of course Al Gore, when he talked about us being greater than a force of nature, he was talking about our technology, but he was talking about how we misuse our technology. So if we greatly misuse our technology, then we get climate change, and we get catastrophe, and a lot of bad things can happen. And we think of nuclear weapons as one example, of course. But the question is, might we also use technology in a very proactive and aggressive way? Just that we've used technology in a very proactive and aggressive way for military purposes, maybe we could use technology in a very proactive and aggressive way for peaceful purposes. And so I'm calling this a force of nature approach. Now, really in this paper, this draft paper, I haven't really had a chance to really develop it according to the title as an original position. So at this stage, we can think about this as being a political conception that I call a force of nature. And we might or might not be able, with more work, to develop into a more Rawlsian original position. But I'm going to argue that we might still want to call it an original position because if you compare Rawls's theory of justice with his Law of Peoples, you find that in the Law of Peoples, he doesn't really develop the original position in any detail the way that he did in the theory of justice. He more or less says, well, let's pretend we've done the original position, let's pretend these will be the results, and I think that most intelligent people that are experts in this area would agree that these are the results, with one exception which might be controversial. And that's what John Rawls would say. And so you can argue that we could use the term original position, but maybe actually it would be better if I said political conception. Or maybe I should just do more work and try to develop a more Rawlsian original position. But anyway, the point is that this is a different approach, but it has some relationship, some kinship to Rawls that I'm calling a force of nature position or approach. And so, as Professor Sen has pointed out, one of the problems is that if you do the theory construction the way Rawls does it, it seems to be difficult to get historical dynamics in there. And it seems like if you want to develop a cosmopolitan and an eternal political conception, you're going to have to think about historical dynamics and somehow get them in there in some way. And it's not easy to do, I think, by taking the approach that Rawls takes. But I could be wrong there, but that's my opinion. Anyway, as we look at this problem of developing historical dynamics and think about the idea of trying to develop a cosmopolitan and dynamic and eternal political position, which of course we're not going to be entirely successful in doing that here, but we're going to try to do it to make a start. We're going to think about historical dynamics and try to put that in there as best we can. So one of my more influential people that I've studied over the years is Kenneth Boulding. So I've taken this, well, I should say inspired. This is inspired from Kenneth Boulding from 1964. I did my PhD dissertation on Kenneth Boulding, so naturally I think he's a very great person, and I think he was a very great person indeed. And so I'm inspired by him in many ways. So this periodization is inspired from my reading of one of his many books, this one he wrote back in 1964. So if we want, we can divide, say, history into 3 time periods or 3 periods of human consciousness. And so we can think about before civilization, before globalization, before civilization, before the year, say, 3,500 before the Common Era. We can think about a second period as the period of civilization, globalization. That would come from the beginning of civilization to the end of civilization, about now. So maybe civilization is ending about now. So we have consciousness too, globalizational consciousness at work from the beginning of civilization around 3,500 before the Common Era to the end of civilization about today. And so beginning about today, the idea is that we have a third level of consciousness, which I call post-globalizational developments. So to give you a little more detail here, in consciousness 1, we can identify that with pre-civilization, where before civilization you have nomadic tribes and agricultural communities engaging in hunting and farming activities. And their technology, by our standards, would be very primitive. They talk various languages, and they use sticks and stones for their technology. They do the best they can with what they have, and make-do technology. And then with civilization, so you have civilization that lasts maybe 5,000 or 6,000 years, ending approximately today. We identified civilization with cities and empires, with trading, and with war. And here we have the idea that we don't just make do with what we have, but we can make new inventions, inventive technology. So we don't just make do with languages, but we invent writing. We don't just make do with sticks and stones, but we invent guns, and so forth. We make inventions. And then the period of time I believe that we're entering now, or if we wish to enter now, we can enter now, if that's our desire and our decision, be consciousness 3, or the period after civilization, Prince civilization. Of course, this is what I'm going to talk about in much of the remainder of my talk, where we talk about intentional communities and the possibility of an environment of peace and freedom. And here we have super technology, or force of nature technology. Now here I'm giving these examples, computers and nanomeds or nanotechnology medications. Of course, when we think of force of nature technology in the past, we can have many bad things to say about it. We can think about climate change. We can think about nuclear weapons and many other bad things relating to what we might call force of nature technology. So I've mentioned here, of course, things that might be more neutral or might be better rather than the bad things. The point is, as I said before, that we've reached a stage of technology where instead of being very proactive and aggressive in producing weapons, why not be very proactive and aggressive in producing peaceful technology instead? So what I'm arguing here is that we can put together in a feasible way, more or less today, a new type of social technology and a new type of physical technology that will produce an environment of stable peace, that will produce an environment of evolving freedom, that will produce a livelihood of great wealth beyond modern scarcity. Now, again, I'm not sure that John Rawls would be happy with this, because at times it seems to me that Rawls has a very puritanical streak in him, where he's afraid that if you go beyond modern scarcity, you may not have good relationships between peoples or societies. It may not be good to go beyond modern scarcity. My position, of course, is very different from that. My position is that we want, along with peace and freedom, we want great wealth also. And I'm going to argue that not only is this thing, as strange as it sounds, the case, I'm even going to make a further argument that it's non-controversial. So for the moment, until I make that argument in a few moments, let's assume, just for the sake of temporary argument, that this is correct. And we can disagree with it later. But for the moment, let's temporarily assume that this is correct, that we can put together social technologies and physical technologies that will help us provide environments where you have stable peace, evolving freedom, and great wealth. And assume that this is non-controversial also, if you like. Well, if that were the case, if that is the case, it seems to me that this is a great moral, political imperative that we must act on immediately. And so, if this is the case, then this would mean that much of the work of John Rawls, the more difficult work that he does, we would not have to either exactly agree or disagree with. He's tried to do something that is very difficult to do. He's tried to talk about moderate scarcity and provide a just society in moderate scarcity, which I think is a very difficult philosophical proposition. What we're doing, perhaps, is much easier than what John Rawls was trying to do. For example, if what we're saying turns out to be correct, then it would mean that many of Rawls's principles would not be relevant anymore in a period of wealth and freedom and peace. In other words, in that new environment, we would not be concerned about principle number 2, equal opportunity, perhaps. Or perhaps we would not be concerned about principle number 3, just assistance. Or in that new environment, perhaps we would not be concerned about principle number 4, permissible inequalities. Instead, we would want to go at a deeper level to probe what does principle 0 and principle 1 really mean. In other words, we talk about basic rights and basic liberties, but throughout history, we've changed the meaning of those words, and we've had a deeper level of understanding. So back not too long ago in history, when we said all men are created equal, we tended to think about white men that were wealthy, white men with land and wealth. They are the men who are created equal. But today we say no. It applies not only to white men, but to men who are not white. It applies not only to white men who are wealthy, but to white and non-white men who are not wealthy. It applies not only to men, but to women also. So as time goes on, we use the same words, the same phrases, the same rights and liberties, but our conception of what they mean changes over time. So I think as a first step, we might think in that direction to simplify matters. We might think along the lines that the principle 0 and the principle 1 might be conceptions that we can use that over decades or centuries we can develop in more and more profound ways. And that means that Rawls made a heroic effort, but maybe our jobs as philosophers might be easier. That is, if it turns out that what I'm saying is true, which at this point, of course, before I present it, is very questionable to you. So let me state then, to be clear, what the principle 0 and the principle 1 is. So the principle of meta-basic rights, there we're talking about the rights required to meet basic needs, at least insofar as necessary for citizens to understand and to exercise their basic liberties. And then you have your basic liberties, of course, which are the traditional liberties we think of, sometimes called our basic rights. Okay, so now we jump to part 2. I think you'll see a big difference now. So we've been talking about a theoretical analysis of John Rawls and then revising him based on the revisions of John Rawls, and then disagreeing with him somewhat and saying we're going to try to come up with something better. And so now in part 2, as we say, if we are successful in what we said we would do, it's going to be very action-oriented, because our claim is that if we are able to establish what we claim that we can, then it's going to be very action-oriented, implementing principles 0 and 1, implementing in an evolutionary way the principles. So we're talking really about implementing these ideas if we can show that they are ideas that are feasible, and even, as I will claim, non-controversial. So let's begin then by talking about how to implement principles 0 and 1. You see, as I say, what I'm claiming now is that I'm going to show you, of course, I'll refer you to other books that you'll have to read, naturally. So after reading these other books, then you can say, oh, I agree or disagree with you. But anyway, as I will present it here, I'm going to present a situation where we can quickly go to producing, that is historically quick, in historical time of hundreds and thousands of years, we can go quickly to producing environments that have stable peace, evolving freedom, and great wealth. And I'm further going to claim that not only is that the case, but this claim is a non-controversial claim as well. So I'm calling this the force of nature approach, or force of nature technology approach to a peaceful and free environment of intentional communities. Now, before I really get into those details of the technologies that I'm talking about, maybe I should make a little more of a transition from the ideas relating to John Rawls and the ideas that I am presenting. So in doing this, I'm going to add another voice to the dialogue from Thomas Buford. Thomas Buford would be my undergraduate philosophy mentor from the 1960s. He's now a retired philosopher, but he still writes professional philosophy. So I'm going to use my friend Thomas Buford, my mentor Thomas Buford, to fill in a gap here between John Rawls and what I'm going to be saying. I don't really know the point of view of Thomas Buford himself and what I would say later. I have sent this to him, but he has not given me his comments, positive or negative or otherwise. But anyway, what I'm saying is that based on the ideas of John Rawls and our traditional ideas that we associate with rights and liberties, it seems to me that we can say that we have a right. We have a basic moral right to live in peace. We have a basic right to live in freedom. So we can talk about an environment of stable peace, and we can talk about an environment of evolving freedom. Because as I say, I don't think freedom is static. I think we may use the same words, but as our consciousness change, we will mean different things over decades and centuries as to what these words mean, like freedom, or maybe even peace also. So we have to think about evolving freedom. What we think is freedom today may be very limited compared with what we think is freedom in the future. Just like freedom before used to mean the white males that own property. But today we think it includes non-white people and people that do not own any property and people who are not males but females as well. And I think we can go much beyond in evolving our freedom, much beyond that. I think we have not reached a very high state, perhaps, in that regard. But anyway, whatever that case may be, one of the points I do want to point out is that if we do have a right, we have a duty corresponding to the right. Sometimes we think of rights and liberties as, aha, I'm going to assert my rights and liberties. But as John Rawls points out, and as Thomas Buford points out, that is a very incorrect understanding of rights and freedom. Rights and freedom is dependent on duties and obligations. Without duties and obligations, there are no meaningful rights and freedoms. They're all bound tightly together, as both John Rawls and Thomas Buford would point out. So wherever there is a right, there's always a corresponding duty or obligation to at least attempt to honor that right. Now, I added the attempt because often we think of rights and freedoms as static and as social, and it's something we either honor or do not honor in our Constitution. But my point is that we also have the injustices of nature, and we also have our mentality increases and becomes more profound, so that our conceptions of peace and freedom change, and our conception of rights and liberties change. So I say we attempt to honor our rights as best we can. And so we see then that the proper conception of rights and freedoms, according to John Rawls and Thomas Buford and many others that have looked at this, means that it's an interactive process, and we are social beings. We're not these egotistical atoms, but it's social beings living in a mutual relationship with each other that establishes our rights and obligations together. You cannot separate rights apart from the duties or obligations relating to those rights and freedoms. Okay, so this may, to some people, just be sort of common sense, but anyway, I'm saying that these are findings based on what John Rawls has said, and findings based on what Thomas Buford says. But I think for many of us, these would just be sort of common sense sort of things that we would agree with. But anyway, we're saying these are our findings, some of our findings here. We have an individual right to life, but our individual right to life means we have mutual obligations to produce an environment of stable peace. We have individual rights. We have individual rights of liberty. But this means we have mutual obligations to produce an environment of freedom. Therefore, we have a mutual obligation to establish an environment, a society of individual rights that includes the right to live in a peaceful community and a free community. And so I'm going to argue that these force of nature technologies can easily be used in a positive, proactive way instead of a negative, military way. And it will produce, along with our consciousness, greater consciousness, a wealthy, post-scarcity environment of stable peace and involving freedom. And I'm further going to claim that not only is this the case, but that this claim is non-controversial. So, first I will briefly discuss the physical technology, and then I will briefly discuss the social technology, and then I will claim that both of these technologies are feasible today, and it's feasible to put the two technologies together today, and that combined, this will give us, in historical time, a rather quickly a peaceful, free, and prosperous environment of intentional communities or green habitat communities. And I didn't really realize until now, someone should have told me about the time. I'll try to hurry up here and get through the rest of it, but here, notice that when I talk about the physical technologies, I'm giving you references to read. So really, I'm making these claims, but of course you will not know how to evaluate the claims until you consult the experts. What I'm doing is I'm claiming that there are experts in reference number 1, and there are experts in reference number 2. You can always find non-experts. They may be scientists or non-scientists. They may be philosophers or non-philosophers. You can always find non-experts that would question climate change and other factors. What you have to do is to find the experts. So if someone claims to be an expert and they don't believe in climate change, study the experts and see what they say. So what I'm advising here is that I believe that I've looked at the experts, not scientists and philosophers who claim to be experts, but those who are experts. So in reference number 1, this references the O'Neill habitats. Reference number 2, the nanotechnology. So you have the O'Neill habitats or green habitats referenced in number 1 and the nanotechnology referenced in number 2. Now, and you can see that these two technologies would come together and produce a great physical technology. But as I will point out in a moment later on, the O'Neill habitats are a technology in of themselves. You do not need the more advanced regular nanotechnology to develop them. So you can develop the O'Neill habitats today. But if you develop the nanotechnology, it makes it easier. So the point is that we can already, since the 20th century, even in the late 20th century, we've had the ability to develop O'Neill habitats. But as we develop nanotechnology, it will make the job even easier, even though it could have been done in the late 20th century without the help of nanotechnology. So I'm saying that if you look at these technologies like the O'Neill habitats and the nanotechnology, that the reason that these are not controversial is because I'm talking about, at this stage, I'm talking about what we would call the far future. In other words, the controversy is when people talk about developing O'Neill habitats, they say, well, yeah, there is a sense in which we do have the ability to do it, but it might take a very long time, an extremely long time to do it. Or, yeah, we are already developing nanotechnology, but to get advanced nanotechnology, it might really take a very long time. And so, in order to overcome that problem at this stage, I'm saying that we can envision ourselves, for example, living in the far future. Now, it may be sooner than that, but most every expert would agree that unless we destroy ourselves or something, that these technologies will develop. And so we can overcome this controversy by imagining for ourselves that we live in the far future, where you have the O'Neill habitats and nanotechnology developed to an advanced state. So in that sense, it's going to be non-controversial. Again, you have to talk to the experts. So I need to, I think, speed things up. But basically, the idea of the O'Neill habitat is that there are unbelievable, totally unbelievable extraterrestrial resources that we theoretically know how to use. We would have to develop a research and development approach over decades. But I mean, basically, it's something we know that we could do if we wanted to do it. It would not be easy, and it's not something we could do in 2 or 3 years. But I mean, it's sort of like something even more grand than the Apollo moon landing. It's something we know we can do, but we don't know how long it will take or how much money it would take and so on. Because there are so many, the extraterrestrial resources by Earth standards are just unbelievable. So you would be able to construct habitats. Now, point out this is not space stations. These are green habitats where you have trees and plants and animals and human beings living in a habitat that is more safe, more green than the planet Earth. Sometimes we think of the planet Earth as being a green planet or a water planet. But actually these habitats would be a higher quality of life. They would be greener and better than living on the surface of a planet. And they would be in orbit around planets and suns. And each habitat would be able to have millions of people. And notice that they would be self-sufficient. And they would be self-replicating, meaning that at a geometric rate, they can reproduce themselves if that's what we want them to do. Now, if we don't want to do it, then it could never be done, or it could be many centuries. But the point is that if we want it to be done, it can be done. In historical time, it can be done very quickly. And if we want them to self-replicate, you can really do a lot if you talk about the geometrical self-replication of 1 plus 1 equals 2. 2 plus 2 equals 4. 4 plus 4 equals 8. 8 plus 8 equals 16. Very quickly, you get up to 1 million habitats, each habitat with millions of people and so on. So it seems obvious in this perspective that in the long run, that most of our children, most of our offspring, will not be living on the planet Earth. As I point out, the nanotechnology is going to be very helpful, but it's not required. We already know enough in the late 20th century where if we wanted to develop a research and development program, we could have done so. So I call these SEGs for sustainable or self-sufficient extraterrestrial, greener than Earth communities or habitats. They would be self-reproducing. biospheres. So basically, you have unlimited free land up there beyond the orbit of the Earth. And this means then you have all types of social experimentation, all types of religious and political and philosophical and all sorts of intentional communities, very different and more diverse than what is possible on the planet Earth. And so I think this is very inspirational here, where we talk about what many of the experts have said. They have said the Earth is our cradle, but we are not going to live in the cradle forever. Said communities are space habitats of the children of Mother Earth. Carl Sagan points out that all civilizations become extinct or spacefaring. That's the choice. Do you want to become extinct or spacefaring? So if you look at the Columbia Encyclopedia or other encyclopedias, mass extinction, they point out that mass extinction is different from many other kinds of extinctions. That mass extinction, the only way you can increase your chance of survival is widespread geographical colonization, such as habitats in extraterrestrial space. Widespread geographical colonization is the answer to mass extinction. All civilizations become either spacefaring or extinct. So now we come to the social technology. We have established, I should claim here, of course, we've established the physical technology, but that alone may not get us to where we want to go. We also need, I think, in combination, a feasible social technology as well. And this is where a treaty would come in, where you have the various states of the planet Earth would engage in a feasible treaty that would be oriented in this direction. Now, this treaty of the states or the peoples of planet Earth would serve two functions. Number one, it would be a gateway between the Earth and peaceful space. So it would mean that the treaty organization of the states or peoples of planet Earth would have to enforceably ban all weapons and all weapons making from extraterrestrial space. And it would also act as a midwife to an evolving extraterrestrial society as well. So if we try to produce peace and freedom and universal wealth on planet Earth, that is very difficult. And in fact, it may be that we will destroy ourselves on planet Earth anyway. But why try to do the more difficult? Or why not try to do both at the same time? If we can establish the legal structure and enforcement powers in outer space, then in the long run, that's where most of us will be living. But if we wait until later, then it will already be inhabited, and it will be like the Earth. It's very hard for us to do something if we've already established our special interest and our practical interest. So banning weapons on planet Earth today would be very difficult and I think impossible. Banning all weapons in outer space today is something we can do today. And if we enforce that ban, it will be true for the future, for our children. And they will live in outer space much better than living on the surface of any planet. So we should be diligent enough to rally supporters. Possibly if we got 20 states together, that would be enough to have a powerful treaty, particularly if most of them were the major ones. Now you realize that once you have the treaty, it would not be the states as such, but it would have its own enforcement mechanism. The treaty would establish an agency for a better cosmos. It would have enforcement power, and it would in fact enforce the treaty against all and everyone. This would include those who do not sign the treaty. So even if you do not sign the treaty, you will not be allowed to produce weapons in outer space. Weapons and the banning of weapons and research on weapons is banned for outer space for everyone, even if you do not sign the treaty. And it's done, enforced by the Agency for a Better Cosmos, not for not by individual states. So we have here an extraterrestrial society of intentional communities. And I've summarized what this would involve in FIT, P-F-I-T, as the framework of the treaty. FIT, P, F, peace, freedom. Weapons and weapon making is enforceably banned from outer space. Freedom. You are free to leave your community and go to some other intentional community at any time. Of course, that would be very different from today because in there would be many types of intentional communities. You can make up your own community and say, follow me. So the freedom to leave your community would be true freedom in that environment. Whereas if you leave your community today, it's very limited freedom, or no freedom at all. And so the society and the communities making up the society would have to work closely together to coordinate these things in a practical way. FIT, peace, freedom, intentionality, transparency. PF, peace, freedom. IT, intentionality, transparency. So this means that as an intentional community, you can make up your own political or religious or philosophical views. Much more experimentation than what is feasible and possible on planet Earth. Transparency. Every community has to be devoted to enforcing the banning of weapons and weapons making in outer space. Every community has to be very transparent that they are actively enforcing peace and freedom, the banning of weapons and weapons making. Well, let's see if that works. Oh, there we go. Okay, it's working now. Okay. Okay, so you can see that the basic idea is that this would have to develop into a law of persons, not a law of peoples. Peaceful, free, intentional, transparent framework is really based on peoples having the right to communities. It's not based on the rights of peoples as such. And so we've made the same distinction that Rawls has made, but we think we've made it very well. A political conception would be the society of intentional communities. The comprehensive doctrines would be the intentional communities. So we have the society of communities. The society would ban all weapons and weapons making from outer space. That would be a political conception. But we would have great creativity with comprehensive doctrines, numerous intentional communities, numerous comprehensive doctrines. Oh, okay. So, just to show you how this works, we can think about, you might have a person with their comprehensive doctrine X who thinks that everyone else is wrong, everyone else is evil. And you have someone else with a comprehensive doctrine Y, and they think that everyone else in the world is wrong, everyone else is evil. But you see that if you can accept this idea of FIT, the extraterrestrial society of intentional communities, peace-free, intentional, transparent FIT, that if you can agree to this, then you could believe in comprehensive doctrine X, Y, and Z. If you can agree to this political conception, then there will be great creativity for many comprehensive doctrines beyond what is possible on planet Earth. And so, of course, the treaty organization will have to be responsible for making sure that the environment of outer space fits the FIT requirements. The Agency for a Better Cosmos would enforce the FIT requirements. You would have to have FIT pre-planning of the environment of space, and even the FIT retrofitting of the environment of extraterrestrial space as an ongoing task. They would have to be expert on the cutting edge of technology at all times. So we have said then that we can there is this feasible technology that we call green habitats. There is this feasible technology that we call treaty organization. If we put them together, they are very powerful. They are a force of nature that gives us an environment completely different from any environment that has ever existed before. This new environment would be an environment of stable peace, evolving freedom, great wealth. And according to what we said, this will be non-controversial because we use only the experts to tell us what to do. So, of course, FIT will not appear overnight. We can initiate the FIT treaty organization immediately, but it will develop over decades and centuries. But if we do not do it now, it may not be possible to do it later. But with this FIT treaty organization, we now have two realms. There's the realm of Earth and the realm of FIT. So you don't exactly have yet the cosmopolitan idea, which is a very puzzling thing to figure out philosophically. When you have only one realm and only people in one realm, it's hard to figure that out philosophically, in my opinion. But here, whether for good or for bad, you have two realms. You have the realm of the Earth and you have the realm of the FIT. So it's not exactly cosmopolitan, as it turns out, in this perspective. So, of course, we do not want to micromanage the future. Many tyrants have tried to micromanage the future. We will have to make things up as we go along. We can initiate it, but we cannot make up the details in advance. We have to make up the details as we go along and try to do things in a safe, non-dangerous way. We can ask, what will it cost? And we can ask, can we afford not to do it? Because we may not get another chance. It may not be possible to do it if we wait very long. But we can do it today. It's feasible today, but it may not be feasible if we wait until tomorrow. And we can think about the principle 3 of just assistance, where the Earth is sort of assisting itself by creating the FIT Treaty Organization. Because by creating the FIT Treaty Organization, you're thinking about justly assisting future generations. You're thinking about the burdened societies of the Earth. So, in some general sense, you're sort of talking about the just assistance principle in a way that Rawls was not talking about it, where the Earth is assisting future generations and itself, because the Earth itself is burdened. The Earth is a burdened society. It's a very special type of reciprocity. Now, in terms of financing, these days you hear about the Tobin tax a lot because people that are interested in solving world problems, they're constantly saying, I have this great idea of how to improve the world. And I also know how to get the money to improve the world. And so this Tobin tax idea is very popular. You have people today, including me, saying, I have a great idea. Why don't we use the Tobin tax to finance my great idea to greatly improve the human condition? But it does seem true that whatever ideas you take, many of these ideas are extremely good on how to improve the Earth or my ideas, whatever. To me, it seems very obvious that the Tobin tax idea is very feasible and it could be used for many good purposes. I would hope it would include my purpose as well. But you could have a tax on the worldwide international currency transactions. It might be set between 1% and 100th of 1%. So I've done a quick calculation here. Please email me if you come up with some different calculations. But we can think about funding the FIT Treaty Organization, the society at a high level, a moderate level, and nearly zero. Now we can do it, the point is, first of all, we can do it on nearly zero because we can come up with a FIT treaty and we can sign the FIT treaty today, and it doesn't require money to do that. But if we want to be proactive, we might think about giving some money to it. So to be proactive and aggressive in our peaceful technology, our advanced technology, force of nature, we can think about financing at a high level, a moderate level, or a nearly zero level. this we can do. And it would be definitely something we need to do now and not later. But also, can we give it some money? And so, please email me if you come up with some different figures, because I may have made a mistake here. But I don't think so. I mean, I tried to do it right. So let me know. What I did is I figure that if you did the FIT proposal, the green habitats at a high level, it probably would be something like double the yearly cost of the moon landing project that the Americans did in the 1960s. As you know, the Americans landed on the moon in 1969. They spent a lot of money on their moon landing project known as Apollo in the 1960s. So I figured if on a yearly basis you took double that amount of money in today's dollars, of course not in 1960s dollars, took it in today's dollars, then double that, you realize America was one country, but I'm talking about a Tobin tax where you have the entire world, not one country. Then here's what I get, and you can check my figures, email me with what you get. It looks like that the result is that if you finance this at a high funding level, that still it comes out to be much, much less than 1/100% of the Tobin tax. So in my opinion, we are very privileged to be the first generation, to be a unique generation, to institute the banning of all weapons and weapons making in outer space. All we have to do is pen and sign the FIT treaty. It requires no financial fees, no taxes. So in that respect, we can say that now, or almost now, can give us almost universal peace, because we're talking about banning weapons from all of the universe, except for one small planet. So if you think about all of the universe, except for one small planet, you're talking about almost universal peace. Universal peace for all the universe, except for one small planet. But if we wait too long, we may not be free to do the right thing. And so here is a quotation from Chapter 4 of The Way and the Power of Virtue, The Way and the Power of Virtue, Chapter 41. And it encourages you, of course, to take action. And in closing, I want to acknowledge the philosophy department here at National Central University. They granted me the time this summer to be a visiting scholar here. And I want to particularly thank Jack Lee, who has been so especially helpful. I need to thank Samuel Freeman for giving me his thoughtful opinions about John Rawls, and Professor S.C. Lee, I want to thank him also. Thank you.
Yeah. Very interesting and actually very enthusiastic proposal on Charles. And so we don't have too much time, but we still could need people
We have a little time.
10 minutes or so.
Yeah, my train will leave,
Yeah, I know that.
but we do have some time.
So anybody any questions or proposals or counter proposals? Anyone?
Do you have copies of this, or you do not have copies of this paper?
We have distributed this paper. Maybe we could have it later on. Okay. But any question coming to your mind?
This is, you try to narrow down the political conception into physical structure and the social structure. And you further narrow down the physical structure and social structure to the weapon. Am I right?
No, to the opposite of weapons. In other words, I was saying that when we think about super technology, or we think about force of nature technology, sometimes we think about the bad things that happen from technology, like weapons. Sometimes we think about climate change as caused from our technology. We think about nuclear weapons. Sometimes when we think about super technology, or advanced technology or force of nature technology for a good reason. If we look at the 20th century was very different from what the people of the 19th century expected. In the 19th century, people thought the 20th century would produce world peace and freedom for everyone. It'd be a great place. But instead, we have nuclear weapons, we have wars, and so forth. So the 20th century turned out to be very different and much worse than what the people of the 19th century expected. So my point is that instead of using advanced technology for weapons, why not use advanced technology for peace, for things like this that we know that we can do if we want to do it. Just like we knew that we could pay money and do the Apollo moon landing on the moon that was accomplished in 1969, it was just a matter of applying our research and development, our resources to it. We're in the same situation here. It might require more countries. Not one country should do it. It would not work if one country did it. For it to work, you needed many countries to do it, and it would require more money. But again, per country, it would be less money. And there are ways to do it with the Tobin tax. Or you could do it with zero money because you're going to sign a treaty. You're going to figure out a treaty, and you're going to have the country sign it. And so, really, it requires zero money. But if we don't initiate this technology, this peaceful technology now, the banning of weapons from outer space, the prevention of weapons, the prevention of weapons making from outer space, if we wait until later, then probably it's going to be hard to do, just like it's hard for us to ban weapons from Earth. It's almost impossible for us to ban weapons from Earth right now. But we could, if we could proactively do it, if we had another continent. If we pretended there was another continent to planet Earth that we have not explored yet, we could say, aha, before we go to that new continent of planet Earth that doesn't have any people there, that's never been explored, let's set up a governmental system that bans weapons and weapons making from that new continent. I think that's a reasonable analogy. But if we wait until we get to the new continent, people will take their technology, military forces, military guns, and so forth, that would destroy perhaps the possibility of banning weapons and weapons making. So I think it is similar to thinking about a new continent, but the new continent would be a better continent than the present continents. And if we don't set up the government and the banning of weapons now, then once people are living there, they're going to have weapons. And it would be hard to ban it once they have them.
So you think that Rawls' theory is not sufficient? It's not sufficient to explain the...
Well, I sort of tried to simplify it by saying maybe if we took principle 0 and principle 1, they're sort of heading in the right direction to do what we need to do. But yet I'm also sort of agreeing with Professor Sen when he says we need to add some historical perspective, some dynamics to it as well. So this is just a draft, so I haven't really worked out the details of the question you asked. But to simplify it, it looks like we could use the motivation of principle 0 and principle 1 and add some historical dynamics to work towards this. As I say, I do not really get to a cosmopolitan and an eternal position, because what I work to is you have two realms, the realm of the earth and the realm of fit. The fit realm, peaceful, free, and intentional, transparent communities, and the realm of the earth. So you really have two realms the way this would develop. Now what would develop 500 years beyond that, I don't know.
Then question. Now, in comparison with the 19th century, people think about the 20th century would be a very prosperous, peaceful, and for all people century. And I think in the narrative, now we are thinking about we have a very bright future in the 21st or even 22nd century and this sort of thing. Now, things historical never come out as we wish themselves. Okay. And also, your suggestion, an extra terrestrial blue planet, very similar to Earth. I know a number of scientists are looking for that. No, but this is kind of, let me say, kind of utopian things.
Well, you see, that's the point I'm trying to make, is that I think most people, that's how they interpret this. My point is that you need to go to the experts instead of saying, well, here's what I think, or here's what this philosopher thinks, or this scientist thinks. You may not be an expert. I may not be an expert. This philosopher who is going to tell us about this may not be an expert. This scientist who's going to tell us about this may not be an expert. You have to figure out who would be knowledgeable about this, who would be knowledgeable about what I call the green habitat technology. Find those people who are experts in that area who really know about it, not someone like me or you, not any philosopher or any scientist, but someone who we know is an expert. And my point is that if you can find the experts, then you have the knowledge that you need to speak intelligently about it.
My problem is, expert doesn't solve our moral problems.
Well, with that part of it, I'm not trying to solve it. I'm trying to solve I'm saying there are two parts.
Yeah.
The one part is not moral problem, but it's the physical problem, the physical technology problem. We have technology that we're using for war and to kill people, when we should use the technology for peace and for helping people. So that's a question of what can we do from a technological point of view. So you can say we need to add the morals to our technology to use the technology in a moral way. But there's this deeper question of whether this is possible from a technological point of view. So you really have two questions. Number one, is the technology really feasible and possible? And number two, if you assume that it is, then how do you guide your technology toward peace and freedom instead of towards war and catastrophe and so forth?
No, of course, we have a very good kind of technology that make us very prosperous, plentiful of resources and this sort of thing. Maybe we could do something easier, but may not be. Okay. Now my point is, if your ideal is yes, it could be fulfilled, then it could be done already here. We don't need to
No, my point is that it would not be done here because the technology is different. This technology cannot be done on Earth.
Let me say this. If you want to try to celebrate a treaty of peace, banning all kinds of nuclear weapons or whatever, if there's any moment in history that we could do this, we could always do it right now. Say that the country here in the United Nations all sign this thing and then release all right. That's okay.
Well, at least
don't need
if
to
we
do
did
that.
that, we would ban all weapons from outer space. That's the first
If
step.
we could ban it here, then we could ban it out.
I'd say we could. I think it's more easier if I go to the United Nations and I say, look, United Nations, I have two treaties here. This treaty says we're going to ban all weapons and all weapons making from the planet Earth. This treaty says we're going to ban all weapons and all weapons making from outer space. Can you sign either one or both? Well, as we know from the United Nations, number one, they would say, definitely there's no way that we can sign the treaty for banning weapons and weapons making on Earth. But in fact, you have a movement in the United Nations, not yet successful, that says, yes, we might be able to sign a treaty that gives us the banning of weapons from outer space. So if you look at the real world, if you look at the United Nations as it exists today, the people of the United Nations say on the one hand, the banning of weapons from Earth is not doable. But on the other hand, they say...
It's easier because since it doesn't matter for those hegemonic countries like USA, because it's a long time ago, so I decided just for good issues. But then, when it comes to the kind of actual situation, really we have some spaceship to go to that planet.
Yes,
Who goes
I agree.
to dominate this?
I agree. That's the reason
Just
why.
like we happen on Earth.
I agree completely.
When I first come to Taiwan,
I agree.
other people come.
I agree completely. That's why in the treaty organization, we have to be very careful to take care of that problem. In other words, as I say, in the treaty organization, we cannot have it enforced by one country or state. We cannot have it enforced by all countries and states. It has to have its own special power and enforcement powers. Because if we do not do it that way, exactly what has happened on Earth, which you've described, will happen to the treaty, and it will not work. When a country, in fact, that may already have happened, because what do we know about the top secret negotiations in the United States and China? In other words, it's very easy for the United States or for China to say, we're for world peace. But what do they do secretly that might be illegal, top secret? You have top secret military action in the United States. You have top secret military action in China. They say, both of them, if you ask them, the top leaders of the United States, the top leaders of China say, we are for world peace. But in fact, they have classified top secret documents as to what their real policy is on the issues. They have a real top secret policy in the United States about what the American policy is in outer space. And I assume that other countries would have a similar. And it differs from the treaties they have signed. The United States and many other countries, I think including China, have signed a treaty that's been in effect for many years that says that we should only use outer space for peace. Well, it doesn't have an enforcement mechanism, which means that secretly the United States could have their top secret policy completely opposite of what the treaty they have signed in the United Nations 30 years ago, completely opposite of what the same treaty signed by China. The point is we have to make sure that they add an enforcement mechanism. The enforcement mechanism has to mean that no one country, in fact, no group of countries, would be the enforcement mechanism. There has to be the organization itself is the enforcement mechanism.
So
Otherwise, it's not going to work.
that means you need to have a very effective and functioning the kind of universal or global organization that could enforce this kind of things.
No, my point is that you do not need
Otherwise,
that.
you could not prevent anybody in outer space to do whatever they want.
No, my point is that you have to be very careful to approach this in the proper way because of the possibility that that could happen. So the way to do it is, number one, in your treaty to ban weapons and weapon making from outer space, you have to put in the provision that, number one, it's going to apply to everyone, not just the people that sign it. And number two, you have to put in the provision that this cannot be enforced by any country. This cannot be enforced by any group of countries. When they sign the treaty, they're saying that the enforcement powers go to the treaty organization. Now, to a limited extent, we have already learned this from the United Nations. Used to, with the, before the United Nations, and until recent years within the United Nations, we have had the problem that when the United Nations want to do something, that you would have a big country, a big and a powerful country, decide to do whatever they wanted to do. And the United Nations would have to come to individual countries and say, look, as United Nations, we have decided this is the course of action, and now it needs to be enforced because people are disobeying the policy of the United Nations. And they did not have anyone to enforce it because each nation would say, well, we're going to act the way we want to do. But in recent years, that has changed. You find now, maybe in the last 10 years, it's quite different in the United Nations today than it was 10 years ago or before then in the previous organization. Today, in the United Nations, you now have the idea, to a limited extent, this was true in the Korean War. Sometimes we talk about the Korean War where you have the United States sending in troops. Now, technically, of course, you had the powers, they exited from the United Nations, which allowed the United Nations to take over the United Nations for that period of time, and then say, aha, the United Nations is going to do this, and we're going to use the American troops in Korea. So technically, because of the exit of the non-American, anti-American countries from the United Nations for a short period of time, you had the United Nations sending in troops in Korea, but actually they were American troops because the Americans were controlling the situation. Of course, very quickly the world learned you don't want to exit the United Nations to let a powerful country to do whatever it wants to do in the name of the United Nations. If a country wants to do something, they should do it in their own name, not in the name of all the world of the United Nations. So, but the point is that that did happen back then, and that combined with what has been happening in the last 5 and 10 years, the United Nations is learning they have to have their own troops. They will have to take maybe troops from different countries. But then they tell the troops, they say, look, you are not a troop of the United States. You're not a soldier of France. You're not a soldier of Britain. You're not a soldier of China. You are a United Nations soldier enforcing United Nations policy. You don't belong to the United States. You don't belong to France. You don't belong to China. You are the soldier belonging to the military force of the United Nations. So in the last 5 or 10 years, I think there's been a big change in the United Nations where they realize that this is what is developing. Now, I agree, it's a very slow development, but we need to encourage that so that that is exactly what seems to be happening, so that it will happen more in the future. That way, individual countries, including large, powerful individual countries, cannot say we're acting on behalf of the United Nations.
We always for the good thing, but in fact, even the so-called United Nations army doesn't work anywhere. When the tribes fighting each other,
That's
they have
true.
to withdraw. They can have no force to.
Well, it's not. No, but my point is that that used to be more true than it is now. It's still true today. My point is that it's not as true today as it was 10 or 20 years ago. The point is we're making small progress on that question. The point is that your point is very good. That's the whole point of why things do not work the way we would want them to work in the United Nations. The point is that we need to encourage that. Encourage it in the proper direction. By not doing nothing, we encourage it in the opposite direction. So we have to encourage it in the positive and not the negative direction.
But you try to you wish for the good things.
No, I'm not wishing.
Power.
I don't want wish.
Power
I want
is that
concrete treaties that are signed,
just a
that are
good
enforced,
idea,
not wishes.
USA just send the army anywhere. They like who could stop it?
Well, the point is that to a limited extent they are doing that today. They used to never be able to do it as the United Nations. The point is that in very limited cases where the Big Five do not veto it, the United Nations, in fact, is able to do that today. And they used to never do it at all, period. So we're making progress, that's the point. Progress is being made. No, I'm not for hope. I don't want wishes, I don't want hope. I want signed treaties where you're committing yourself to do
That's the
something.
problem. Which country would like to sign that kind of treaty? That
Well,
isn't their own.
Well, that's my point. What is the argument against it? We are the people, we tell our countries what to do. What is the argument against banning weapons and weapons making from outer space? We are responsible as individual people to tell our country and to tell the world what they're supposed to do. It's our responsibility, not to wish, but to take political action. Am I a philosopher or am I a political philosopher?
I think everybody here would like to have these guys. But
Yeah, my
how
brain
could
is...
maybe it's better. Okay. All right. Anyone else? Question?
I hope we can figure out a way maybe to put this on the internet, or maybe I can put this on the internet so that you can read it, because I'd like to receive your emails to get your specific suggestions. Not only the type of suggestions that we've just heard, because most of the points that are made are very good, except the point is that we need to do something. But also, one thing I'm concerned about is my Tobin tax idea, whether I've calculated that properly. In other words, what I've done is that I've said that it looks like if we wanted to fund this project at a very high level, that we could use a Tobin tax to do it, and then I've made the calculations. Have I miscalculated? Because according to those calculations, much less than 1/100% of all international financial transactions would give us the money we need. Now, I agree that we might want to use those on United Nations projects. In fact, those get the higher priority. You have the United Nations Millennium Development Fund, which has a good shot at getting these Tobin tax funds. I also advocate that part of the United Nations Millennium Project, they have what they call the project, the State of the Future, that they should get part of the Tobin tax funds. But then I would hope that also the FIT project, banning weapons and weapons making from outer space, would get part of the money also. Of course, if you have money, then that gives you a certain force, a certain power that you would not have by just wishing or hoping.
How about who would like to subscribe to this test?
Well, the only test
Who would like
is,
to subscribe? Who would like which country? When? In charge of
well, it's our responsibility as individuals to tell our country, why are you not supporting the banning of weapons from outer space? You say that my country is for peace in outer space. Why are you not supporting peace in outer space? As citizens, that's our responsibility.
just like
Just a small question. You have emphasized only on ban of making weapons out of space. There are also many social problems. So, will you include all those problems in FIT, or you will keep it outside? Besides banning, besides making weapons,
Yes.
there are other social
Yes.
problems.
I see your point. Yes. Well, that's an extremely good question. And the way I've tried to approach it is by thinking of FIT as the beginning of solving that type of problems that would come up. In other words, you say, aha, we have peace. But just having peace, you can have many problems. So I say freedom. You can live in another community because it's easy to build other intentional communities. And I say that it's intentional because it's experimental. And then I say it's transparent, meaning that every community has to be transparent in the enforcement of peace and freedom and the FIT program. So the idea is that if you did this correctly and if you followed the proactive FIT implementation, that this would prevent many problems and it would help manage many others. I also say, of course, that you have to solve problems as you go along. You cannot try to second guess the future of history. So there's no way that I can really second guess what problems will occur. But you have to put yourself in a structured situation where you feel that you have some possibility of solving those problems. So, for example, you can say that by banning weapons and weapons making, with the transparency and the enforcement involved, that you might have a good shot of people not making and using weapons very often. You would sometimes fail probably, but at least you would do a pretty good job in general, I think, if you wanted to under this program. Now, many of our problems, of course, are because we do not have great wealth. Well, this program, at least hypothetically, would seem to solve the problem. Because of the abundant resources, everyone would have easy access to great wealth. And then you have the practical problems of when people disagree with each other on the same piece of land. There, you would have to figure out mechanisms to peacefully manage disagreements, mechanisms to peacefully manage when people disagree with each other. Now, the beauty of FIT is that one possible solution sometimes would be that the persons, they would just divide into two. They say, well, it's very easy to build a space habitat. So instead of having one community, now we have two communities because we disagree. Many religious communities on Earth have done that. Historically, you will have a religious community and the different factions will disagree and they split into two religions. And then they will split into 3 and 4 and many other religions. Here, though, we're talking about communities that have access to building very easily new land, a new community, with no great difficulty and being very wealthy. So that would solve some of the problems, but still, you will have to work out mechanisms for what you do if people are in conflict, but they cannot kill each other to resolve the conflict. And there will be some conflicts that by saying just go your separate ways, they would not want to do that. They would say, no, we insist on solving this problem. I'm not going to leave, and we're not going to form two separate communities. There should be only this. So there will be those problems, but we have to figure out how to solve them as we go along. But I just think if we structure it this way from the beginning, there will be fewer problems to solve later on.
Then bring this question back to more fun. Now, you know the reason that by John Rawls. Now, later on you treat that from his comprehensive account of just society, kind of political account. And you seem, maybe I missed some of this. You seem to take the words, you say it should be a little more comprehensive thing. Make good what you wish. But then, just now, you will face the same problem here, because a comprehensive account will amplify so much things, so much individual interests, and even preference here.
Well, see, I'm wanting to promote that. I think that's good, not bad. See, my point is that's good. That is, if it's practically feasible on Earth, because of physical and social constraints, it's not practical for us to break up to many different communities. There are many constraints, both physical and social. But in that different environment, the situation is completely different, where you can break up and you can experiment much more.
You are human people there, and we cannot do much different.
Well, I don't know. I think the environment you live in makes a big difference as to what human being you feel you can be. In this environment that we presently live in, I think that we probably need weapons. But I hope to create an environment in which weapons are banned.
But I mean, if you just replicate the whole human type of species upon this new planet, the same problem after there, just be happy.
Well, unless we think
you are
ahead.
not going to say that you
Unless
only
we
allow
think
one species human being, say the white Anglo-Saxon people. You have allowed a lot of different people. Then the same social, political, global problem would replicate, just like we have.
Well, in a space habitat or a safe community, if you want to have all white people in one, that's okay, or all black people in another.
White people still fight each other.
But I suspect that many of the communities, they're going to be aligned on religious grounds, or political grounds, or philosophical grounds. But still, we would say, yes, you are permitted to do this, because the question is, are you going to follow PFIT? Are you going to help us ban weapons and weapons making from outer space? If you want to live in a community of all white or all black people, that is okay with us, as long as you help us ban weapons and weapons making from outer space. As long as you ensure freedom, so that the people that make up your citizens can leave your community and go to another community that they think is a better community. So yes, I would expect that most people would align on political and philosophical grounds and religious grounds, but some people might align on skin color. They may say only white people or only black people are allowed. Under this program, that would be permitted because they would be enforcing peace. They would be enforcing freedom. They would have an intentional and transparent community here so that they could live peacefully together. That's why I say comprehensive doctrine X, comprehensive doctrine Y. They all may seem very strange to us, and we would say they're very wrong-headed. But under this political conception, they can all live peacefully together and be very happy together, I think. Okay, you need to get me to the train station, right?
No, it's all right. Okay. Any burning questions or?
And you have my email address, I hope. My email address. How does this work?
I don't need the answer. I just want maybe we can think that the principle ensure the confirmation result. You have principle and comprehensive doctrine in your
Could you get page number 1 like you telegraphed? I'll say that again. I'm not sure if I understand.
You have 5 principles, and you also have
Oh,
comprehensive doctrine. That's the principle is to
Oh.
ensure the confirmation result.
oh,
Comprehensive
I'm sorry. I guess I did not explain that very well. The 5 principles are what I believe to be, I claim that they are the 5 principles of John Rawls. And I further claim that these 5 principles make up the political conception, but not the comprehensive doctrine of John Rawls. So John Rawls would say that I think my interpretation is that John Rawls would say that by using these 5 principles, you would have a political conception that a huge number of people, perhaps almost everyone, could live in one society under a political conception based on these 5 principles. I believe that's what John Rawls would say. And so the people living under these 5 principles, he would say, they would have many different religions, many different philosophical viewpoints, many disagreements and conflicts. But at least if they agree on the 5 principles, they could live together well in a just and fair society, in one society together. I think that's what John Rawls would say. Now, the way that I've developed it, the society is made up of intentional communities, and the intentional communities represent the comprehensive doctrines. And the society as a whole, fit, peace, freedom, intentionality, and transparency represent the political conception. So what I'm saying is, has some analogy to John Rawls, but not a complete analogy.
Okay, I think it's time's up, and then thank you very much, Dr. Tandy, for your splendid proposal, and we will hope that it will be realized.
Please write to my email address.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.